Hi guys, this is a video for absolute beginners. So if that's you, this is for you. And we're going to cover a couple subjects here. We're going to cover brushes that we use, we're going to cover the paint that we use, we're going to cover a couple blending techniques, where to use a lot of paint, where to use just a little, and how not to turn all of that into a big muddy mess. And anything else that you might find helpful as an absolute beginner. And this video is going to be made out of a couple different segments, so just if the first segment maybe not what you're looking for, just wait for the next one. There are going to be a lot to come, so just make it through the entire thing and hopefully you'll find it super helpful. All right, so let's talk about our brushes first. And let's start with acrylic painting. So we host a lot of acrylic painting events, and we have a lot of acrylic painting tutorials. And we usually use student grade acrylic paint. Now, if you don't know what student grade acrylic paint is acrylic paint that's A, a little cheaper than professional acrylic, which is yay, big bonus, and B, why we love it is because it's more liquid than professional acrylic paint. Professional acrylic paint can be very thick and you might, as a beginner, find it very difficult to work with. So you might consistently have to water it down again and again and again and again. Student grade acrylic paint comes with more liquid consistency. So it's pre-mixed with that water that you're going to need. So that's why we would highly recommend it. Now I'm going to show you which brand we use. Does not mean you have to use that particular brand. You can use any brand that is available in your area. The only one I'm going to caution you about is a dollar store paint. And again, if that's your choice, if you prefer that paint, go for it. I'm not going to tell you not to use it, but if you decide to go with dollar store paint, you're going to need to buy every single color because it does not mix well. So we usually use teaching primary colors only. Primary colors are yellow, red, blue, plus black and white. Now, if you decide to go with a brand that's our brand or any similar brand, you can just get away with using those colors and mix them. And we usually show you, actually not usually, always show you in every tutorial how to mix paint out of those colors into every shade imaginable. However, if you prefer to go with dollar store paint, you will need to buy every single shade needed because you're not going to be able to mix your colors. It just doesn't mix well. So let me show you the paint. This is the acrylic paint that we use. It is Starred brand student grade acrylic. It is really nice. It's quite liquid and the colors are very beautiful and bright, and it's a good paint. But again, there are a lot of similar brands that you can find. If you're not sure, go to your local art store or call them and ask what they have available from student grade acrylic paint and what they would recommend for you. And just make sure it's not too thick because that's important. However, a lot of the times we actually water down our acrylic as we paint, and we will discuss that later where we do water it down, where we don't. But yes, we don't always just use it straight from the tube. A lot of the times, even student grade acrylic paint, we water down. But we will tell you when and how and what and why. Now we also do watercolor tutorials. So you're free to use any watercolor. And I'm going to show you two different watercolors here. This is one of the professional watercolor that I have. This is Koi watercolor. And let me open it. And as you can see, it's pretty big. And it has a lot of colors here. Now, a lot of people ask what to use, tube or dry cake palette. Doesn't matter. Whatever you prefer, both good, regardless. If you prefer tubes or if that's maybe what you have, maybe someone gifted you tube watercolor, you can use it. If not, you can use a dry palette like this one or any other one. A lot of videos I actually created with this watercolor, which is the most basic watercolor you can find. This is a Crayola washable watercolor for children. So if that's all you have access to, that's totally fine. That is more than enough. The only two differences are this one doesn't have as many pre-mixed colors, so you're going to need to do a little bit of mixing, which is fine, not a problem at all. Again, we will show you and explain how to mix them. And this watercolor, in comparison to my professional watercolor, is going to be slightly dimmer color. So that one is going to end up slightly more vibrant and bright. But other than that, there's no difference. You can use whichever, absolutely. And for oil paints, I unfortunately don't have to show you, but we do have an oil painter on our team, and she uses water mixable oil paint. So again, you're free to use any oil paint. It's just you might need to use extra components if you don't use water mixable. For water mixable, you just need oil and water, nothing else. So, but your choice. Now brushes, let's talk about brushes. So this is what I have here. This is a watercolor brush. Now what are we looking for when we talk about watercolor brushes? The most important thing that I personally find for watercolor brushes is the pointy tip. Do you see how this brush has a very, very, very pointy tip? So that's important. I have all numbers from 0 to the biggest one is 16, but I can do everything that I need with 16, even the finest details because of that pointy tip that it has. So that's mostly what you're looking for in watercolor brush. And another thing that's important, it needs to be soft. You're looking for a fairly soft brush. So natural hair brushes are great, but synthetic ones are fine too, as long as they are on a softer side. So this one, for example, I wouldn't say it's the softest brush I've ever had. Like for example, my makeup brushes are much softer than this one, but it's definitely on a softer side, and that's what you want for watercolor. Now, as far as numbers, we get a lot of questions of what numbers are good. Doesn't matter really, as long as you have pointy top, but if you are going to buy a set anyway and you just need to know which ones are best, buy a couple different sizes. It's good to have 0 because a lot of details we do in watercolor are very small, and 0 is the smallest brush that is there. Maybe there are 00 and 000, but in zeros, that's what you want. That's a good brush, but also something like 6 and something like maybe 8 is good to have. But again, you can get away with just 1 as long as it's a very, very good brush with a pointed tip. Now for acrylic brushes. I have these brushes right here, which are great. They're my favorite. They're very well loved. And most of them are in a really bad shape because they're very old. I also have some newer brushes here that are kind of the same. There's no difference. They're still square. They're just, some of them are a little smaller. Some of them are a little bigger. They're different sizes, but they're same shape. And they are for acrylic as well. Now what you're looking for here is the texture. So it needs to be not crazy hard. So it shouldn't be like very stiff because that's an oil brush. But it shouldn't be very soft either because that's watercolor brush. So it should be this in between. It should definitely be on a harder side, but not a crazy hard. So we would recommend definitely synthetic brushes versus natural hair brush because they are on a stiffer side. So definitely look for that stiffer brush, synthetic brush, but not crazy stiff. It shouldn't be, it should bend really well. So let me show you. You see this one? It is a stiffer brush. So when I push on it, it doesn't just go down right away. It has a bit of resistance because it is a stiffer brush. But also it's not crazy stiff. It doesn't take me a workout to just move this brush. So that's what you're looking for. Now as far as shape, it doesn't have to be square. Square is my personal preference, but different artists on our team host to using different brushes, and some of them include pointy brushes, some of them square brush with a rounded edges. So any shape of brush will work. And again, if you're just buying a set, it's good to have a variety. It will be good for you to have maybe 3 square brushes, something like that, and something like that. And also the same with the pointy brushes. Something small, something bigger, and something big. And also for acrylic paint, it is very, very important that you have a good detailed brush because there are a lot of things that we use it for. There are a lot of details in our painting. So this is probably the most important brush that you will get for acrylic paint. And if there's one brush that you want to actually invest in and buy good quality, that's this one. Because this brush gets ruined first. This one always goes first. We have to throw it out and replace. There are quite a few that we go through years with these brushes, and the rest ones, the big square ones, they last forever. So if you were to buy one expensive brush, buy this expensive brush. The rest you can buy cheap brushes and it'll still be fine. So you might want to get large, medium, small, regardless of shape, or in each shape, depending on your budget. But again, remember, most important, this brush. And the most important thing about it is it needs to have a really nice pointy tip as well. Because if your brush doesn't have that pointy tip, you're not going to be able to get fine details no matter how skilled you are with acrylic. So very important pointy tip brush. And I think that is pretty much it for our brushes. All right, and let's actually talk a little bit more about oil brushes. So oil brushes, again, you can use any shape, you can use square, you can use pointy. I believe our artist uses more of a square brushes, but it's very important that they're very stiff. The stiffest brush you can find, that would be your brush for the oil painting. So grab that stiffest brush you can find, and that would be perfect. And yes, of course, they have to be synthetic as well, or at least we recommend synthetic. Now, in addition to your large, medium, and small brush, you would probably want to have a palette knife. It doesn't matter what size or shape. This is just what I have right here, but you can use smaller, you can use bigger. And yes, you can definitely paint with your palette knife, but also what our oil painter Nadia uses palette knife for is mixing paint. It is the best tool there is out there to mix oil paint with. So you're definitely gonna need that, any palette knife, to mix your oil paint. Also, in regard to oil paint, you will need one large blending brush. This is what I have. This actually came from the art set that I have, set of brushes, so it's art brush. However, if you grab any wall painting brush in Home Depot or any hardware or renovation store, that will work really well for you, or even dollar store. Dollar store has a lot of wall painting brushes, so you can grab it from there. But keep in mind, you're gonna need one soft blending brush. So this one, you wanna go as soft as you can. So harsh brushes for actually painting with oil, soft brush for oil blending, and big. It needs to be a bigger brush. Now, a lot of people ask about fan brush. So I have a small fan brush here. We don't require fan brush. If you have it, great. It could be very useful for you for making clouds, for making trees, for making waves. There are a lot of different ways you could use a fan brush. So if you have it, or if you just personally would like to buy it and experiment with it, absolutely go for it. But we do not require it for any of our tutorials. And I think that's pretty much covers all our brushes. Now, let's move to our next segment. Now guys, in this segment, I am going to show you how to blend, and there are a couple different things that we're going to explore here and talk about blending a little more. Now, let's start with what brush is the best. Biggest brush that you have. Again, I'm not going to be using that really big brush that I showed you, the one that for blending in oil, because I'm going to be showing you how to blend in acrylic, not in oil. So I'm going to be showing you using the biggest acrylic brush that I have, which is this one. In the most of our tutorials, or at least in the most of tutorials that I am teaching, this is the brush that I'll be using for the background, because that's where the most of our blending is. It's on a background. So this is usually the brush that I will be using for blending those colors. Now, we usually start painting with a background. So again, we're trying to cover the largest areas, and that's where that blending usually is. So you're going to be covering large areas. And what I highly recommend is that you use a liquid paint. You don't want to use, so let me actually start showing you this. I'm going to do the first blending. I'm going to do purple to, let's go to pink to white, because those are compatible colors, because purple is made out of pink and blue. So those are very compatible colors. So we'll mix white to pink to purple. And I'll show you that transition of 3 colors, and I'll show you how to blend on wet, because that's what we usually, or at least that's my favorite method of blending on wet. I find that it's the easiest, and you will find it probably the easiest as well. So let's do that. I'm gonna take some white paint here. And I'm going to take some red. And my red is more of a magenta red. So that's actually important about colors too, is that we use only primaries, but the primaries, it's important what kind of primaries there are. If you have primary red, primary blue, primary yellow, great. But if you don't have those available and you have all those different shades and you're not sure which blue is the right one, which red is the right one, The safest thing to go is go with a red that has the pinker undertone. If it looks almost like a very concentrated pink, that's a great red to go with because it's going to give you beautiful purples. It's going to blend into every single shade that you need it to blend into really well. Now stay away from the reds that have tint of yellow into them. So if red has a hint of orange to it, that's not the red you want to use as your primary red, because that red that has a hint of orange into it, it's not going to give you beautiful purple. If you try to mix purple out of it, you're going to end up either with a grayish color or even with a brownish color, and that is not what you want. So always for your primary color, in absence of actually primary color, go with a red that has a pinker undertone, the pinker red, or even dark pink. Now, in regard to blues, it's the opposite. If in absence of primary blue, you want to go with a blue that has more of a greener undertone to it, colder undertone, such as my blue right here. This is the blue that I'm using. Here's the name of it. So if not primary blue, this is the best blue to go with because it will still give you a beautiful purples, but also it will give you a really good teal colors. And we use teal a lot and we use green a lot. So that will give you vibrant shades of green and beautiful teal. The blue that you want to avoid is ultramarine blue. Do not use ultramarine blue as your primary blue because ultramarine blue is blue that kind of has that pink pre-mixed into it just a little bit. It has this hint of warmness, hint of purple. So when you try to mix green out of it, because it already has that red mixed into it, it's not going to give you good color. It's going to give you, again, this muddy, brownish green, which is most of the time not the color we're aiming for. So this blue is the best, or primary blue, or any blue that's on a colder side and has no purple mixed into it. That's important. So I'm going to grab this blue as well. All right, I have my colors, my brush, and my water. So let's remove this black canvas for now. Let's put our paper. Actually, let's put it like that. So I'm going to start with white here. I dipped my brush in the water because we're blending on wet, and I'm going to be showing you right now on a pretty small area. However, usually we're covering larger areas up front with this blending, so you might want to take a bit more paint than what I'll be using now, again, because of the area that you're trying to cover up first. So I dipped my brush in the water, and that's very important when we're covering uncovered canvas or paper. You want to use a lot of water. Otherwise, it's really hard to get all the way into the canvas. So if you just use not enough water or not enough paint, but usually not enough water, you will see those specks of white canvas coming through even after you blend. And we want to avoid that. We don't want that look. We don't want to see that white canvas. We want a full coverage. So that's why it's best to dip your brush in the water before you even start going into paint. So dip it in the water, then take some white, and I'm going to take lots and lots of white. Here you see brush full because I'm going to blend on wet. So I don't want my paint to dry by the time I move to the next color. So I'll add first color, then wash my brush, add second color, blend. Then third color, blend. So I need the previous color to stay wet. So that's why I'm using quite a bit of paint. So I'm going to go right here and I will add some white. And because I'm going to show you a couple different things to blend, we might be working in two different spots at the same time. So also we're going to need the paper towel because I usually, after I wash my brush, I would dab it off on a paper towel to get rid of all that extra water. So now I'm going to dip my brush in the water again. You see, dipping my brush in the water, and now I'm going to make pink. So pink is very simple. It's just white and red. So I'm going to scoop some of that white on the side, add some red to it, mix it up, and here's pink. And this pink I'm going to add right above my white. You see, right there. Let me show you guys closer. It's my white and my pink. And this is going to be blended on wet, but because underneath of it, we're going to blend on dry, let's add this pink underneath as well. So on the bottom, I'm going to I'll add one more line of pink, and I will let this one dry up. Now, here, what you can do, you can continue blending right away. You don't have to wash off your brush. You can just dab it off on a paper towel to make sure it doesn't have too much paint left. So your brush needs to be almost empty of paint by this point. If you run out of paint and you have none left, that's great. You don't have to dab it off on a paper towel. In my case, I still had quite a bit, so I dabbed off all the extra paint on a paper towel, and now you can just go right in between these two colors, you see? And go left and right, back and forth, and you see it smudges that inner area. But this only works if both of your colors are still really wet. If one of them is dry, this is not going to work as well for you. So this is blending on wet. You put first color, right away you put second color, and then with a brush that either clean and dry or just doesn't have too much paint left, you go right in between the colors. And if you want to spread it a bit more up and down and create more of a gradual blending, what you could do, you could go a little bit down with this, and then a little bit up, then a little bit down, then a little bit up. And what that will do, you see, it created more gradual blending. What that will do is that your brush will pick up a little bit of that wet pink and spread it down. Then it'll pick up a little bit of that white and spread it up. But never go all the way up and never go all the way down. You still want to see some fresh white and some fresh pink. So that's great. Now we're going to move to our next color, which is going to be our purple, because we have to go fast. This is starting to dry up. So I'm going to dip my brush in the water. I'll wash it again. And I'm going to make my purple. So I'll make a little bit more pink, and then to the same pink, I'll just add a little bit of blue. Maybe a little bit more red too. And you see, it turned into purple. Now with this purple, I'm gonna go right above my pink right here. And right away, I'm gonna dab off my brush, and I'll blend the same way that I did. Do you see? I dabbed it off so it doesn't have too much paint left. And I'll blend the exact same way that I did blend my pink and my white. I'll go right over the edge where two colors connect. And then maybe a little bit up and a little bit down. And here we have 3 color blending, and they're all compatible. Now let's talk about bottom, because we added that pink. And it's pretty dry at this point. It's not wet, so I'm not going to be able to blend it on a wet. Now sometimes that would happen that you would add a color, and then by the time you're ready to blend it, it's already dry. So how do you blend it if this color is dry? So let's add our purple again over it. And you see, you go right to the edge where these two colors connect. And even better if you can even overlap it a little. Do you see, I'm going to go a little bit over that pink and overlap it by this much. You see? Now, to blend on dry, what are you going to do? You're going to wash off your brush. So wash it off really well. Now, I'm not going to dry it to fully dry. I'm just going to dab it off on a paper towel. And with this somewhat dry brush, I'm going to go right where the two colors connect. Now for this, what's important is that your brush is clean and slightly wet, because what it will do, it will water down that dry paint already there. So the moisture from the brush will go into the paint. The paint will get a little more liquid, and it will give you ability to spread it. So basically you just water down that still fresh purple and spreading that over that dry pink, and that gives you the blending. So this is how you blend if your first color is already dry. So you just blend with a clean, slightly wet brush. So this is a blending on wet and a blending on dry with compatible colors. I am back, and now in the segment I'm going to show you how to blend not compatible colors. So how to make a nice blended transition from colors that don't necessarily combine well. So in previous segments we tried making transition from purple and pink and white, which is great, and Those are very nice colors, but they're very compatible because purple is actually made out of pink and blue. This time we're going to try to transition yellow and blue without them turning green. Because as you know, when you mix yellow and blue, they turn green. And sometimes, for example, if we're painting sky, there will be times when we would want to add blue sky on top, and then yellow, maybe a little line that indicates the sunshine coming through in yellow, but we don't want any green in between. So I'm going to show you how to do that. And the way we're going to do that is we're going to add transitional white. So we're going to do blue, then transitional white, then yellow. That way, as we blend, we're going to blend both colors into white. So visually, you're not going to see that white. It's going to look like there is blue that gets from darker blue to lighter blue, and then there's yellow that gets from lighter yellow into the actual yellow. So you're not visually going to see as much of that white, but it is there. So that's how you transition colors that you don't want to mix. So I'm going to grab blue, white, and yellow, and I'm going to show you how to do that. And we're going to use our large brush as well. So I'm going to grab my big brush, dip it in the water, and I'm going to make, I would say medium blue. I don't want to be really working with the dark blue right now because we rarely do sun and dark blue sky at the same time. We usually do medium to light blue for our sky and then a little bit of yellow for the sun. So we're going to make our blue. So we're just going to take some white, some blue, mix them up, make medium to light blue. This should be good. Now this color, I'm going to go right here. And I'm going to add, oops, a line of that. Now I'm going to deal with this dripping situation right away because we don't want it to go any lower than that. This is good. Now this we're going to blend on wet as well. So it's very important that you do this fast. So now I washed my brush. I'm going to take some white and I'm going to add a line right underneath. And now I'm going to blend my white into my yellow, into my blue. You see the same way that we did with our previous two colors. And after that, only after that, I'm going to move to my yellow. And I'll take some yellow. I'll mix it with the white a little bit because I'm not trying to make it bright. I just want some light yellow. And I'll put it underneath. And now this yellow, I'm going to blend into this white as well. And now you see it visually looks like your yellow is merging to your blue, but not. This white little buffer line makes such a big difference here. That's why it's not turning green as you are creating this transition between blue and yellow. And this technique will work for any colors that you don't want to mix. So for example, maybe you're trying to make gradient between purple and orange. Those colors don't mix well. They're going to turn into brown, muddy color, not pretty. So any colors that are not either compatible or you just don't want them to mix and create another color, always add buffer white and blend the first color into that white first and then blend second color into the same white. So white will disappear because you're blending other colors into it, but visually it's going to look like they're transitioning without any additional creation of color or creating a muddy color. So that's pretty much all that you need to know about blending. And we're going to move to our next segment.
Hi guys, I'm Lisa from Artist Palette and I'm going to be showing you a little bit on dry brushing. So sometimes in our tutorials we show a technique, usually by me. I like to do some dry brushing techniques, which is very little paint, and I want to show you just how little paint that we use sometimes. And this can be for any brush. So you just want to start with, you want a little bit of water on your brush, but you don't want it like dripping with water, and you don't want to, when you like squeeze or bend it, it just all drips out. So we want that to be not as heavy with the water, okay? And so just squeeze out any little extra bits of that water that was retaining in there. And in terms of picking up your paint, you're going to, for example, if we were to make, this is good for clouds, this is good for galaxies that I've done, a lot of things you can do. And when you're dry brushing, I'm just grabbing, I just like to grab on each side of my brush. You can see that it's just mostly coated around, and that's still quite a bit. So what I do is sometimes I'll just dab it on my napkin until it's more inside the brush instead of fully coated around it. And whatever brush you decide to use too, you're just going to kind of lightly press at this point. You're just kind of gliding it. And this can be good, for example, for clouds, if you're just trying to make little wispy clouds. So if you just lightly, and you can use the flat side or maybe the thin side, and it will still come off a little bit more transparent. And you can still see some gaps in between. It's a little bit more of a wispy kind of look. See, just very faded, and it's not as clunky and chunky. So if I were to take a lot more paint and not dry it off, so that's very wispy. If I were to go on the other side and make a cloud, you'll see that this is much more textured and very opaque. This one's more transparent. It soaks up more of the background, and you can still see some of the blue, right? But this one is pure white, and that's just a lot more paint. That's when dry brushing is really good for stuff like that, especially when you want things to not be so opaque, not be so bright. This is more faded, and it also is really good for making fog or mist. So if I wipe off all of this paint again, just wipe it off or dab it on a napkin, you can do a bit of a misty look. You can even make it look like this yellow is a little bit lighter, so a bit more misty looking, and it tones down all that yellow. Just, you don't have to press. The harder you press with this, the more the white is going to show through. If I press a lot harder, it's going to come off a lot more stronger, and as long as you still have very little paint, you can still see that blue thread, whereas this is a lot of paint, very thick. Okay, so another example on dry brushing is if you want to make more of like a textured wood, like for example wood. You could make wood look like it has a bit more texture into it, and what you can do is you can just start with whatever wood that you might have, or even just gray. You can make gray wood or brown. So I'll just grab something to start. And say we're just making like more of a wood background. And you have your base coat. Maybe you're filling it in. But you'll notice that if I just take a little bit less paint and I just kind of lightly streak it up, you see all those gaps right there? And no water, that's what you're going to get. And I think that's really good for creating some sort of certain textures and making it, this also helps you see how it can be more transparent because it still shows the background. And this also means when you're trying to dry brush on top of your background, because it's usually layering, what you're using this for is to layer on top of something that's already filled in. You need to wait for it to dry, because if you try to do this on top of a wet background, you're just pulling off paint instead. So if I were to try to put accents of maybe white over top and I'm trying to dry brush it, it might pull off the paint instead. So you just have to wait for things to dry in between what you're doing. So we'll just wait for it to dry, and then we can dry brush and put maybe some more texture on top of that when it's dry. Okay, so since this is pretty much dry, I just made a little bit of a lighter brown. You can add a little bit more white to it or some yellow with some white. And you can, again, wipe off some of the paint and just lightly press just to get a little bit of texture here. And you can still see that brown through it while trying to put on another layer of this color or even whatever color you're trying to do. You get all of these little gaps and spots in through it, which I think helps with, for example, that wood texture that you might be achieving, or anything else that we could be doing. So that's an example. And I just lightly glaze it across, just lightly pressing. You can see it wasn't pressing too hard. The harder you press, the more the paint's going to come off and make this really thick streaked line of paint, basically. Okay, so in the next segment, I'm going to talk about basically how to not make a muddy mess and what that kind of means and how to avoid that, as well as a little bit of layering. Okay, so let's talk about layering for a little bit. So you can see here I have some green. So this could be the start of some grass. I went up and down, just made a base coat. And when we're teaching about layering, a lot of the time, usually letting it dry is probably a good idea, because otherwise you're blending on top of the wet paint, which we covered. If you leave it wet, you're probably helping it blend together. So if you're trying to make it look like it has depth, that's when it dries, it's probably the best results too. So whatever brush you are using, maybe you're detailed or maybe something like this that's more of a bright, flat brush, which is, I think, great for making grass and grass stems, grass blades, that is. You can take from your green, so if you have like a basic green, you can start with even just a shadow. And it doesn't necessarily have to be just green. It can be, like a brownish green. It can make it look more realistic with a brown bit of color in there. And even for highlights, just yellow and white or just white. So it doesn't all have to be just green. And if you're doing this while it's still wet, it all just blends together and becomes the same green you started with in the first place. So I'm going to mix some into my brown that I had before. I can mix right over top of it. Like that, and maybe let's add in some white first as a different kind of green. So it already looks a lot lighter. And it has some brown in it, so it's a bit more toned down. And when you're doing this, so if you're, example, this is for grass, you can start usually from the back and start kind of flicking it upwards. Using the thin or thick side, you can do the same thing. Work your way down, do a couple streaks of this. All the way through. And I'm going to actually mix some black into this and make it even darker so we have an even darker shadow. I'm going to take black and then I'll just take regular blue. Sometimes you can just do that or add a smidge of some green to it or even just some yellow. So it doesn't have to be exactly just a green color. This is much more of a shadow, so it's going to have more black and darkness going through it. This adds a lot more shadow and depth into your grass as well. So sometimes if you find that you have a lot of paint chunking around it, just take some of it off. You don't want a big blob going onto your canvas. And again, just do the same little thing. You don't need a whole lot of paint for this. You can do a bit of dry brushing so that it's not coming off like a big blob. It looks a bit more, it's still leaving some of the color showing through it sometimes. And if you're finding that it's a little bit too dry, it's okay if you want to take a little dip of your water again. pick up a little bit more paint, dab some of it off, and keep going. It comes off a little bit more sharper too. You use the thin side, just right on the tip. You can just lightly flick it up, press, and then pull away from the canvas too, so that it stays a bit lighter and thinner at the top. So from here, I'm just going to wash this off. And again, you can wait for things to dry in between. Otherwise, if it's not dry, it's going to pick up all that black and probably keep it really dark and spread around the black. Before we do our highlight, I like to sometimes just take yellow, scoop of it with a dot of my regular green that I had or any other darker green. Much more like a lime green, and then a little bit of white. You know, white is good as a medium. It can white into any color, can make it look more opaque. And just when it's dry, you can even use the flat side. You can use the flat and thin side. And it looks like it should start developing a bit of layers. A little bit of water, picking up more paint. And this will get rid of any dry brush that you think you see that's starting to happen if your brush is too dry. You can make your strokes a little more smooth. You can still see some of this black in between, just from all the layering. The dark green. So I'm going to wash this off, and you can keep going with more green. There's more colors you can add of different greens. Maybe even just adding blue by itself will make your grass look a little bit more bluer and teal in general. But let me just see. I just take a little bit of blue, add a touch of green to it, and you can add this in. And even though it's not making your grass blue, but you can see it's a nice little extra bit of color. And blue is fairly dark too, so it can help make it look like it's a bit more darker, shadowed, especially if you want to add blue and black instead as your shadowed color. So there we go. We have lots of different colors in our grass. And then at the end, usually I finish up with a highlight when things are dry, because when you try to highlight with white or with just anything with lots of white into it, if it has a lot of darker colors that are really wet, it tends to pick up that color and not be the highlight, and goes back to the color that it was. And you can use detail brush for highlight, which is probably best. A little bit of water. Pick up some white, dot of yellow. And I like to just go along the back, lightly pressing. Water. And for this, what I'm doing is I'm just holding my brush a little bit further back and barely touching the canvas, and letting my wrist do a lot of the work just by flicking up from the bottom. And it gets a nice little bit of highlight in here. You can start from the back, work your way to the front. You can do a little bit towards the bottom. And I also like to twirl my brush So it's not too thick, and it stays thin on the end. You can go through and you can put as much highlight as you want. So if you do too much highlight, acrylic is very forgiving. You can always go back and just put in a little extra shadow here and there, just around maybe where your highlights are. So it looks like it's from dark to light and more individual grass blades. Okay. So that is a little bit on layering and using grass as an example. But the key is letting things dry, and you can see all the wonderful colors through, whereas if it was wet, it would probably make a little bit more just a same color situation. This is all kind of in the green family, and if I were to put any more browns into there, or if I were to add different colors like purple, it would probably start making just a muddy mess. Okay, so the last little part is talking about how to not, again, make that muddy mess. We want to avoid doing all of that. And I was saying before, if you use a lot of paint, you're at risk of doing that because it's not going to dry as fast. And if you're impatient or you're not letting it dry, maybe you want to keep painting, it's just going to keep spreading that color around. And eventually it could probably make brown and things that you don't want. So if I'm starting with, I'm starting with any color here, I'm starting with blue, and I have all of this paint, see here on my brush. This is only good if you intend to maybe fill in your background. You need a lot of paint, or you're trying to be very textured and make things really thick looking. But if you just start placing it on, you don't really just kind of put it there and you're just making something. Maybe you're just trying to make water, okay? Putting a whole lot of paint. Big scoop of it, and you're just putting it on. And you're like, okay, here's my water. And then you want to put a highlight, or you want to put a reflection, and especially when it comes to reflections into blue water, and you're like, okay, I want to do light yellow, and you don't wait for it to dry. You just take it. You have light yellow here. You're gonna notice that you can see streaks, and not only just the streaks, it turns green. So if I'm using a lot of paint, it doesn't dry, and it shows all of my texture, all the streaks. And if I'm avoiding making it look like that and trying to go for more realism and not very textured, impressionist style, that's not going to change. And if you keep trying to put more paint on top of it, you're like, okay, I want it lighter, adding more. It's going to spread all of that blue around while it's still wet too. And another reason how things can turn into a mess too is if you're trying to do these layering like we just did before, and you're trying to just add different colors on top. So if I were to reflect, maybe I wanted to reflect something in my sky like a purple or an orange color. If I wanted light yellow and some red to make orange, and I wanted to reflect it, notice how it's not spreading very well. See, this is a lot of paint. This might be a little bit of an over-exaggeration sometimes, but this gets the point across, because even if it's still damp and you're trying to keep going over and over, you'll notice these streaks. And you'll notice that it's not blended, it's also not doing what you want it to do. It's not making a reflection. And then if you're like, okay, well, I'm just going to make it blue again, and you're at the verge of maybe starting fresh, Now you're blending it all together, and now it's no longer blue. So everything has to dry if you're trying to layer, like something like grass, for example. So keep that in mind, and you can see the amount of paint really affects drying time too, as well as the streaks. If you have a lot of paint, you get all of the streaks in here, which if you're trying to not show your brush strokes, you're trying to only take a certain amount of paint, like picking it up with a little bit of water, but not like a whole ton of it. So you just kind of spread it around a little bit, like that, twirl it around, and then I like to flatten this flat brush down. See? Keep it in its shape. It's not too heavily coated. And when I do a stroke, I go back and forth, it's more sticking to your surface instead of all of that texture. There's a time and a place for that texture if you're trying to go for texture, but overall with acrylic painting, this is what we're trying to do. We're trying to make things more smoother, and we're not trying to show too much of our strokes unless we are doing it on purpose. So, and also this is good for drying time, and you can always add more layers and depth into things when this started off as a flat green, but now it looks like it's a lot of depth, and we didn't have to use a whole lot of paint to do and achieve something with lots of color going through it with not as much paint. Okay, so in our tutorials, hopefully you have fun watching us and painting along, and hopefully this was helpful for just absolute beginner things, keeping certain things in mind. We try our best to explain what we're doing, but sometimes when we're saying we're doing a bit of a dry brush, we say little paint. Now you know you need literally very little paint, and it's for a purpose. And if you're adding too much water, that can also pull off your paint instead of adding more on and letting things dry. So if you notice that it's still damp and you go and you try to put a watery paint on top, it usually tends to pick it up again and to remove it from your canvas. All right, so have fun painting, and we'll see you on our paint-alongs. Okay, so for our next segment, let's talk a little bit about details. And sometimes some of that just means making trees, and I know trees are probably one of the biggest things that people have a little bit of a struggle with, and it's mainly because of how you hold your brush, your type of brush, so hopefully you have the right one. If you're trying to make a tree with something like this and you're trying to make it more detailed, it's not going to work. You need something more detailed sometimes to be able to make those thin branches and thin lines. So let's just whip together some sort of brown. And usually when you make brown, it's really easy to make brown without trying, but when you're trying to make it, all of a sudden you cannot. So I always start with equal parts red and yellow, and then I add a little bit of black, or you can add blue until you're happy with your brown. So not really important on what brown we're making, but as long as you have an idea of what we're doing to make these trees. Just using a bigger brush to get this color going. Alright, so if you do have a bigger brush that you want to start with, usually we start with something a little bit bigger, but a pointy brush is great too. And water is key. We always say use a little bit of water, kind of spread it around, make it a little bit more loose, and we can just flatten this brush down. Not too much paint, not too heavy with the paint. It's like nicely coated, but it's not blobbing and all globby all over the place. So depending on your tree, let's do something basic. You know, trees have this little bit of a trunk, right? And that's where you can press a little bit harder, but then as they go towards the top, they start to thin out just a little bit. And each tree can vary too. And trees are not perfect, so I see a lot of people trying to make these perfect straight sticks and no bumps and grooves. I'm doing this on purpose. This is what I'm going for. I don't want my tree to look perfect. I want it to look imperfect. And now you can switch to something more detailed, something smaller, still with a little bit of water. And when you're doing this, it tends to start making a bit of a Y shape, but notice that the line is thinner now. But also you have to make it look proportionally right, so it's not just going from really, if it was really wide to really tiny, it needs to stay just a little bit more kind of thick throughout, kind of a bit more even, just slight gradual thinness towards the end, so that it looks like it's still trying to spread and grow. And the way that I hold this, when I take it with my detail brush, again, I'm just twirling my brush here on my palette to keep it thin on the end. And I'm just using, usually with every reload of my brush, I'm taking a bit of water as well. I like to hold it a bit further back on my brush handle. Start pressing harder and then press less and lighter towards the end. And when you're making a branch, see, it comes off, when you're pressing harder, it comes off a little bit thicker, and then it thins out on the end, just like, so it looks like now it's connecting. It's not, if this is connecting, it has more of a flow, like it's going up. We're not doing that. We're not pressing hard doing that. We're not doing tiny little sticks. We're not doing stuff like that. And you just need a little bit more water and paint when you see that. Okay, and the other thing we're not doing is we're not doing branches like this straight down. And we're not doing tiny little branches on the end. So if you want to make elegant looking flows, kind of like there's maybe another tiny little twig coming out, it's still usually going up and growing outwards, up towards the sky. And it has some little bend and curve to it, not a straight little stick. So this can really help you with being able to make look like the trees have a bit more natural imperfections, which they all, that's what makes it a tree. We're trying to not do this stuff because trees don't normally do that, and it doesn't make it look natural. They're very imperfect, perfectly imperfect. That's what makes them look nice. Okay, so, and it doesn't matter where you place your branches, as long, or whatever tree you're making, as long as usually, unless it's a dead tree, they're growing up towards the sky. And it doesn't have to be straight up. It can be just as long as at some point, usually it goes upwards because that's where they're growing to. And you can also, so remember, press and then just lightly, just grabbing more paint. You have to have patience here. And just lightly doing a little bit of a bend, groove, and it flows down in with the rest of the tree. You can always extend things. Twirl my brush and start lower down. The more bendy and groovy you make it, the more gnarly it looks. And usually the branches tend to be a little bit longer, not too short, right? Makes them look like it has height. Really short branches like this, they're not going anywhere. But you can do smaller ones on the ends, just little smaller ones. And this can be good for making, if you want to put leaves and flowers on the ends of them. And you can intertwine. Pressing harder down here, and just leaving it nice and thin towards the end. Okay, so here's the difference on one side. You have more of a natural looking tree forming. You can add more branches, right? The other side is what we're avoiding. We're not doing these things. That's too much. That's less paint and less water to get very inconsistent lines. And also these kind of sticks that are just sticking out without any little shape to it, slight bends or curves, or maybe the the bumpiness. You don't have to make it perfectly straight, right? It's not natural. And sticks pointing down, that means usually on a tree, it's a dead tree. So if you're trying not to do that, you're going mostly upwards. And when you're branching off of your branches, so you're making branches following your tree, your shape of your tree, it starts off a little bit thicker, so you're pressing a little bit harder, and then you're flicking it out and pulling it away. It's okay to go over the same spot with a bit more paint and water, but as long as it's a bit thinner on the end and it's thicker and flowing, so you're just tracing it back into the tree, so it's flowing all together, and it looks natural, and it doesn't look like it has a sharp edge like this or a ledge going on. It looks a bit more natural instead of a random, sudden, pointy cactus thing coming out from the side. And we just went over making little twigs on the ends, so in case you want to add a little bit more branches on the ends, a lot of trees have that. Again, we're making just again a little bit, still following the same rule of a little bit of a bend and not straight little sticks, tiny little ones. We're doing more elegant and still keeping it very thin, following the same, letting it flow from the branch coming outward, and it looks a bit more natural.